Welcome to this lecture again in our ÖFG Peaceful Change lecture series. I talked about this last time already, just going to repeat it a bit again. We are in the midst of looking at different functional orders in international politics. And we talked about migration recently, for example. And this time around, we're going to talk about the climate. And I'm very happy to have Professor Gabriele Spilker with us from the University of Salzburg. Under normal conditions, there would be a round of applause now for you, Gabi, and just imagine it. Let me very briefly introduce her to you. She is Professor for Methods in the Political Science Department at the University of Salzburg. Was previously a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard, a senior researcher at the ETH Zurich. I'm really just going to highlight a few things because she's done a lot of great things. She specializes on climate change and what climate change does to other policy fields, for instance, migration and conflict, more generally into international political economy, also studies public opinion. And Gabi has published very widely and really in the best journals in the discipline. That includes International Organization, International Interactions, Journal of Politics, International Studies Quarterly, many others. She's also authored 3 books. And Gabi, I'm very, very happy that you're with us today. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand over the word to you. The talk is going to last for about half an hour, and then we're going to have plenty of time to ask questions. Gabi, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Markus. I'm looking forward to giving this talk. I'm just quickly sharing my slides. I hope that everyone now can see the slides. My talk is called The Forgotten Crises, Combating Climate Change in Times of a Pandemic. It is a topic that is very dear to my heart, namely climate change. I didn't plan to talk about my own research today, which is mostly on climate change, migration, and conflict in developing countries. Although I'm, of course, very happy to talk about this in the Q&A. Rather, what my plan to do is the following, namely to make kind of a plea that we really need to take climate change seriously, that we need to take action seriously. Yet what it's more, or what I would like to argue today is, for one, I would like to convince you why climate change policy, especially international climate change policy, is so difficult to tackle. And I have 4 reasons why potentially climate change is simply the hardest problem that one can imagine, and that really is combines the most hardest, most annoying features a problem can have, and makes it really super difficult to tackle at the international level and at the domestic level. I will make this in 4 or will give you 4 reasons for this. In times I compare it to what we currently see in the pandemic, a bit like giving you reasons why potentially, or why we see so fast and intense policy action in response to the coronavirus, but see comparatively little action or policy action in response to climate change. Although, as this cartoon over here shows, many would argue that this is a huge problem that just sits behind our backs currently. And this made, and this is a picture here below, Fridays for Future, together with Scientists for Future, which I'm a part of, and the Austrian team, have this big motto in their last big World Climate Day, that we should fight every crisis. At the end of my talk, I will not only give you 4, or have given you 4 reasons why climate change is such a difficult problem to tackle, but I will also make an argument for what is an additional aspect of climate change that I will think needs much more of our attention currently receives, in my opinion, way too little attention, and which will in somehow for me be the defining feature of our times and how society will deal with this. So let me start. What am I talking about? Something that we know for sure is that in comparison to the so-called pre-industrial reference period, which is this period over here from 1850 to 1900, temperatures have strongly increased. This is what this line shows over here, which compares both observed monthly global mean temperatures, which is this grayish spikes over here, going all the way over there, with how much of this is induced by humans. That's us, that's the yellow line, and the confidence interval around this, compared to different model simulations, such that we know how good our climate modeling is, which you can see is very close to actual temperatures and how much humans have induced. And this is the forecast of where this is going to go in the near-term future. And as all of you can see here, and of course know already, namely that temperatures increase. That's something that we know for sure. What we also know for sure is that specific consequences of climate change have already materialized or will materialize. Temperature increase I've just shown you, which will result in more droughts in various regions of this world. What also already happens and will happen much more frequently in the future is a changing variability in precipitation. Why is it here variability and not temperature increase or mean precipitation increase? This is because, oh, I'm sorry, I just hear an echo. So the changing variability in precipitation means that it will be less predictable when it rains and how much it rains. It will rain at specific times of the year much more than it used to be. And so the variability and therefore also the predictability of precipitation will change, leading to immense difficulties for individuals who live from agriculture, for example, and who depend on this precipitation. Furthermore, sea level rise will happen, warming and acidification of the seas, more extreme weather phenomena, such as tropical storms. We already see this, glacier meltdown, fewer permanent ice and snow-covered areas, and the like. What will happen, though we don't know when, how, and to what extent, is potential tipping points that are inherent in our climate. This is from a publication in the Proceedings of the Natural Academy of Science by Lenton et al. Here they illustrate certain potential tipping points that might happen in the climate system, meaning that once we surpass a specific level in our climate change system, such as if enough ice sheet of the Greenland ice sheet melts, then this process will be irreversible. So we will move to a next level without us being able to go back to this. There are some researchers who argue that this has already potentially happened for the Greenland ice sheet, so that this process of reinforcing the melting might already be happening without us being able to go back. Furthermore, what this leads to is depending on how further the temperature increase will go, and what this will mean for us humans will depend a lot on whether we will be able to stop the global warming, or maybe one should even call it global heating, at the 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees, or even more. And what you see here is that with every degree or half degree of temperature increase more, the risks to, such as water scarcity, soil erosion, vegetation loss, will be much higher. So violet, or the darker here, the purple, or the darker the colors here, the more or the higher the risk will be. This is from a special report on climate change and land from the IPCC. And what this entails for me are two things. One is that there are huge dangers inherent in climate change. However, and this brings me to my first reason why climate change is potentially a difficult problem and a difficult problem for policymakers to tackle, is what you see here is that there are a range of options that happen depending on how large or how intense the problem will be. The risk for us humans will be bigger. So we know that the risk will be there. It will be a huge risk. There will be a lot of damage, but exactly how large the damage will be depends on how extreme the problem is, when we will stop emitting CO2 or methane. And it depends also, if I go back, on these potential tipping points that sit behind it. No one can actually completely predict today when this will happen or under what conditions it will happen for sure. What this means is a situation that is kind of similar to what we see in the coronavirus situation and kind of not. On the one hand, we see that we have scientific progress and evidence that often does not seem to match the clear communication as needed by policymakers and the general public. This is something we also see in the corona crisis, I would argue, that the way science produces evidence, that it finds evidence in favor of something, but has a confidence interval around it so that this might happen like this or this. Like if you just go back on this slide, we see it here. So we might end up here or we might end up here, but this is the interval of where it could happen. This is something that is natural, that's for scientists, that's the way we communicate science, but this is not something that the general public is used to, and it's also not necessarily helpful for policymakers because it gives them a sense of, okay, there is leeway within this. There might be, we might go in this direction or we might go in this direction, but it doesn't say clearly if we continue like this, then this exactly happens in this. We say that if we continue like this, then the risk for extreme climate events will be enormous. It will be, the risk for sea level rise will be this and this high. But it's not like very specific predictions that are able, that means we have some leeway. That means policymakers might take this as, okay, maybe it's not that urgent to act. Furthermore, communicating this way of making scientific progress to a general public, as we have seen for or during the pandemic, is really difficult and really tough to communicate to a broader general public. So that's my first reason why I think tackling climate change is rather difficult, since kind of translating scientific progress evidence into what policymakers need and into what the general public need isn't easy. Reason number one. Reason number two is that both in its geographic and in its temporal consequences, climate change will be very, very uneven, or is already uneven. So we have already some regions in this world that experience really tough consequences already. And there will be some regions that will face much higher and severe consequences than they currently are. Here is a multi-sector risk map, also from the IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. And what they do is they put in, or that they calculate different types of risks for land, for water availability, for precipitation, for the risk to see extreme events, and put them together in an index that combines these multi-sector risks. And what you can see here is the different risks between a world that heats up to 1.5 degrees or a world that heats up to 2 degrees. And again, the darker the shade, the higher the risk. And what you can see here is that this is very unevenly spread, and there will be certain regions with a huge risk, here combined with vulnerable population added, and there will be regions in which the risks won't be too high. Furthermore, what is behind this graph is, and this combines, if I just quickly jump back to here, is that these are of course simulation and predictions what will happen in the future. So these are risks that will materialize, but have not or only have partially materialized. What this also means, or what we need to take into a combination, or what we need to combine this with, is who emits most of the CO2 emissions. And what this graph shows you is both current and historic CO2 emissions. And what you can see is that historic emissions, starting back in the 1900 to 2018, that the composition of those who emit has kind of drastically changed, in that specific countries such as the United States or the countries making up the European Union have always been large emitters. So we, as being part of the European Union, have been part of the emitters for all of history, but certain countries such as China or India have only more recently come or joined this club, if you want to say so, as the big emitters. What this means is that if we combine this picture with this one here, we see that mostly those that emit or are the biggest emitters are not those that are those that will face the biggest consequences. At the same time, we have certain countries that will face large consequences, such as India, but also partly China, that only more recently have become big emitters. What this means is that, as a second reason, geographically and temporally, the cause and consequences do not match. What do I mean with this? This is a very unfortunate situation, in that we, as in living in Europe, but also partly the United States, we caused most of this problem, if we want to say it like this. But we are not the ones that, for the time being, have to face the biggest consequences. It is other countries that currently already face the biggest consequences, like the small island countries, but it's also other countries, especially countries in the global south, that will face big consequences. However, these countries are not, or the population of these countries are not represented as in the electoral politics, for example, of the European Union countries or in the United States. So they have no say in determining the policies in those high emitting countries. The same is true if we look at it from a temporal perspective. Many of the consequences of the really big consequences will materialize in the years to come. So it will mainly hit our children and the children of our children, but they currently also do not are not represented in the electoral system of our countries. So we have a complete mismatch between those who emit, who cause the problem, and those who face the consequences, which also is an additional reason why policymakers, especially also policymakers who frequently face re-elections, do not see potentially the incentives of enacting measures that are really costly, such as many climate change actions are, for something that will only either materialize in the future or mainly profit other countries. So the incentive structure is, if you want to allow me to call it, simply ugly in some words. This feeds into a second difficulty stemming from the way policymakers decided to regulate climate change internationally. This slide simply lists the historical milestones in the international regulation of climate change. I do not want to go much into detail here, yet I need to highlight 2 or 3 aspects. One is that with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, something was established that is called common but differentiated responsibility. What does this mean? It was established that specific countries, that we all are in the same boat with climate change because it is a global problem. So we have a common responsibility. However, it was clear that specific countries had more to do with the causes of this problem than others. So some, it was clear, had to do more than others. And in some sense, this is not really controversial, or was not that controversial. It was implemented in the so-called Kyoto Protocol as those who were part of the Annex 1 who had to live up to clear emission targets, and those mainly developing countries who did not. But this common but differentiated obligation formula or doctrine, if you want to say so, had as a consequence that it kind of introduced a rift between countries, in those that had to do something and those that didn't. And at this time, it included China and India, which then became, however, one of the biggest emitters. And countries such as the US, whose role we probably later can talk about in the Q&A, didn't do their fair share to combat climate change anyways, but they made the argument that what is any good international climate change action worth if the big new emitters are not part of it? But at the same time, China and India, among others, said like, yeah, that might be true, but you know, historically, we were not the biggest emitters. So don't we have the right to do this? And we have this doctrine that says we have this common but differentiated responsibility. So no way that we commit to clear obligations in terms of emission reductions. This led to almost a big failure of the international climate regime that had to negotiate a successor to the Kyoto Protocol, which was clear that it anyways will only last for 2 periods and will stop here. So we needed a new agreement. And it looked like as if nothing could be agreed upon until Paris in 2015, where they made a huge turnaround and created a very, if you want to say so, weird international agreement that said, okay, we agree on one thing. We really need to limit global mean temperatures to 2 degrees, better 1.5 degrees. Yet how we get there is something we cannot really decide. So every country by itself makes its own nationally determined contribution, NDC, and gives its own target. And we have this bottom-up principle. Very interesting, very novel approach. Probably the only approach that was feasible at this time we see. So what this means is that there's no more clear binding emission targets, but every country, every entity, such as the European Union, decide on their own what to do. What this interestingly results in is a situation that is so far not sufficient and not satisfying, in the sense that most countries had their first national determined contribution that was either insufficient or highly insufficient. Only very few, such as Morocco, did submit an NDC that was comparable with or compatible with the Paris Agreement goal of limiting global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. And what this means, if you add this up currently, that's what we do here. That's the pledges they made for the NDCs. That's their current policies. We are way above the limit where we want to be. So absolutely not enough action here. What this means is my reason number 3, that we have this international cooperation that was from the beginning hampered by this free riding problematic, in the sense that it's a global problem. We need everyone to contribute. And so everyone just hopes that the other does it. That's one problem. And the other, this difficult legacy of this common but differentiated responsibilities doctrine, as I just explained it, which meant that everyone was pointing the fingers on someone else instead of moving together and getting to the action. So that's my 3rd reason why climate change is so difficult. The 4th one is illustrated here, which is a picture that shows you where the emissions from the European within the European Union compared between 1990 and 2017 come from. And I do not want to go much into detail here. The only thing that is important to me is that every part of our economy, every part of our life contributes to the difficulties and makes climate change harder. That means that our entire way of living contributes to climate change. And that makes it very different, I would argue, to the current situation, to the current pandemic we are in, where we hopefully find, or now it looks like we have at least 3 candidates for vaccination, which means we have the innovation, hopefully we need to get this pandemic under control. This will be, or this is very different to climate change. There won't be one innovation that solves climate change. Rather, we will need numerous innovations, a lot of numerous innovations, in the sense of we need to change how we eat, how we live, how we work, how we travel. Everything will have to change. And this, in some sense, makes it just so daunting in that we have to change so much and so often that certain policymakers then just realize, or also some people simply think like, oh, this is almost an impossible task, right? And if it's impossible, why then start at all? And this is just something that makes climate change hard, super hard to tackle. But I still argue that the most important challenge that we will face with climate change is an even additional one, but that has a lot to do with the one I just presented. What I think will be the most difficult part for us, especially in the liberal democracies in industrialized countries, namely the question how we manage the societal transition towards a more sustainable future. What I mean by this is the following. All climate change policies, because it implies a complete change of our economy, the way we, as I said, work, live, travel, go on holidays, implies that it will have enormous redistributional consequences. There will be lots of people who will lose their jobs because of climate change policies, simply because we, for instance, don't need any coal mining anymore, hopefully, rather soon than later. However, there are workers currently who are in this sector. So what to do with those? What to do with workers in steel mills and the like? What to do with people who will simply lose their jobs because moving towards a more sustainable future, we cannot sustain these specific types of sectors anymore. And there will be others who will suffer economic losses. Why so? Because traveling might become more expensive, because meat consumption might become much more expensive. What to do with those? How to deal with these changes? And I argue from my other research on globalization processes, we know that these redistributional processes that we have seen induced by globalization leave a lot of people unhappy, a lot of people out of their jobs, a lot of people who economically suffer or who think they economically suffer. And to deal with these individuals, to deal with these parts of societies is an important but an Herculean task. And my argument is that we better start thinking how to do this, in the sense that we need to compensate the losers in this process. Because if we don't do this, this will provide further ammunition for actors that we already see have very well mobilized the losers out of these globalization processes and kind of strive to tear societies apart, who are these are populist parties, right-wing populist parties, who kind of already, as we can see it, use climate change and point towards as if it's a discourse by some elites, by some scientists who sit there in their Elfenbeinturm and ivory towers and talk about something that the normal person cannot afford to do and the like. And we cannot, I would argue, let this happen. We really need to think about how to deal with this aspect of climate change policy, in the sense of we need to find ways to retrain parts of societies to find new jobs. We also need to think about actual real compensation in the context of the welfare state for those individuals who might not be able to find their jobs. And this is something that I would argue we have, or we should have learned from how globalization has affected various societies and how they have dealt with it or not have dealt with it. And we should learn from these processes and really think about how to deal with this. But also this entails a second aspect, or a third aspect, so to say, that is, we need to think about how to communicate this better. Especially parties such as green parties need to think about, and everyone who wants strong policy action on climate change need to think about how to communicate this in terms of that we do not let this happen, that specific actors can use climate change policies as a way to picture this elite-driven project that is kind of far away from the real problems of people. Because, as I hopefully made it clear, the consequences will be huge also for individuals here. And so it's really all of our jobs for us and for our children to do something, but we better think about how to do it in a way that manages a societal transition that is fair for everyone. And before I stop, I present you my favorite quote on the topic of climate change, which I hope won't happen here, which is a short story. That is a short story about 4 people: everybody, somebody, anybody, and nobody. There was an important job to be done and everybody was asked to do it. Everybody was sure somebody would do it and anybody could have done it, but nobody did it. Somebody got angry about that because it was everybody's job. But everybody thought anybody could do it. Nobody realized that everybody wouldn't do it. It ended up that everybody blamed somebody when actually nobody asked anybody. And this is where I hope we won't end up here, but rather think about how to move forward in a way that is does both solve climate change, get us to stick to the 1.5 degree target, and at the same time have a societal transformation that brings most people with them and has a, doesn't result in a even more polarized society that we might already live in today. That is where I want to end. I'm looking forward to questions.
No, Gabi, thank you so much for your presentation. There was really a lot of material now, both actually about the climate, about climate change governance, towards actually probably a new model of society. And so I think there's a lot on the table. And without any further ado, I'm going to start the questions and answer session. So I think, Caroline, if I interpret it correctly, then you have your hand up. And I'm always going to do, no, it's fine, yeah? And I'm always going to do 3 questions at a time. Okay, Caroline, you're going to go first.
Thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting and I would agree with everything you said 100%. I think that the title of today's lecture kind of implied that during the pandemic, nothing is happening with regards to the climate crisis. And I think that if it weren't for the pandemic, right now, all eyes would probably on COP26 in Glasgow, which was postponed to next year. But in my opinion, I think we've actually seen quite a lot of action in the last weeks, months. We've seen some ambitious pledges from many countries, many of which were probably not that expected, like China and South Korea and Japan even. Some maybe a bit more expected, like Joe Biden and the US with them wanting to come into the Paris Agreement again. However, my question would be to you, don't you think that the pandemic has maybe given us even a bit more time to push countries even further on their ambitions, and that maybe the COP26 might actually create an even bigger momentum next year than it could have created this year. Thank you.
Caroline, thank you. And then we're going to move on to Ivan, please.
I'm going to use this microphone and the second camera because something is wrong. So thank you very much for the new insights and worrisome thoughts. I would have 3 short questions. So first one would be on the level of joint international efforts. Is there any progress possible? Is there any discussion which leads to serious results without having China on board? And while on the topic of China, the decarbonization plan of China, which I think spans to the next 60 years, what are the implications of this, and do these predictions that you now showed us with the visualizations, do they capture this? Are these possible changes included in these, or is this, I mean, we don't know how they will develop, but as we know from experience, China usually sees its plans through. And the third one would be just a thought. Did this COVID situation reduce carbon emissions in terms of people commuting less than normally? So is there any, so to say, silver lining to this situation, even if it's temporarily? Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have one more question in our first bundle of questions, and that's Karina, please.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much. I have 2 questions. The first one of my main takeaways from your interesting talk is that science, public awareness, which will lead to public policies, and international cooperation have to interlink in order to tackle climate change in a meaningful manner. So do you have any kind of input on how to get this happening? Because it seems like a very important but yet difficult task to manage. And my second question relates to public awareness, because for COVID-19, the public awareness has spread quite fast. And I think the reason is that the disease is direct and everybody can see the results and the effects that the disease has on oneself and the persons you know. While climate change is happening slowly and one doesn't see the direct impact, rather the impact is happening indirectly, and as you said, geographically and time-wise, not as direct. So do you think one could kind of learn anything from the COVID crisis in order with regard to crisis communication, so that it could be a lesson for climate change? Thank you.
Karina, thanks a lot. And Gabi, I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, and you need to interrupt me because once I start talking, I hardly stop because these are so many great questions and so many important issues. I might start with the last set of questions on public awareness and how to communicate. I completely agree with Karina that it's a big difference between the corona crisis and the climate crisis is really that many of us do not have this hands-on experience with climate change in its direct exposure. I mean, this is not true for all people in the world, but for us here in industrialized countries, often it is the case. And so one might argue that it might differ once we get more exposed to it. There are some interesting studies that look at California and its experience with wildfires. And they investigate whether those individuals who experienced the intense wildfires over the last years and experiencing ever more intense wildfires, whether they become more aware and more willing to do something for climate change. And interestingly, on average, it is the case. Yet even this experience is seen by many people through their party lens, in that this effect is much stronger for Democrats and much less so for Republicans, in that we have, especially in the United States, we have this problem that climate change got polarized so much in this party or two-party system, that this is often seen as an issue that is extremely partisan and therefore very hard to achieve bipartisan support, which would be necessary for really strong action on the United States. So someone else asked what I expect internationally. Of course, I expect the US to re-enter the Paris Agreement, but the Paris Agreement is structured in a way that this doesn't mean that much as long as a country doesn't make its own pledge towards real climate action. So entering the Paris Agreement by itself is nice, but is in some sense is not that meaningful without a clear domestic pledge towards more climate action, which might be very difficult in the US system. Does that mean it's completely hopeless for the US? At least lots of things happen on the federal level in the US, on city level even, and this will for sure be much easier now that Biden will become the US president, since he won't put any stones in the way of states such as California who want to go much further in their combating climate change. Is there a silver lining because of Corona? Combining these questions, is there momentum because of the pandemic? Here I'm really not sure. In the sense, on the one hand, what this has shown to us is, I think, or at least to parts of the population, I think, an awareness that something needs to change and that something can change. What I think the pandemic has really shown is that we are capable of immense change. Yes, but what it also has shown is that for climate change to really, for us to really get this problem solved, so the first lockdown where we really had an almost standstill in our economic life and traveling life, this was kind of the way we would need to go if we really want to make a difference. So that the difference we need to really achieve the Paris Agreement is huge and it's massive. And this kind of brings us to a problem in that then suddenly again, people tend to say like, maybe the task is just too big. So how we don't even know where to start or not. I'm not sure. At the same time, what has happened, and here I agree with the first person who asked the question, is that we currently see an interesting momentum, and here China, here you are, China plays an important role, namely that by making this pledge to become carbon neutral by 2060, China just maybe changed the game in saying like, if China made this pledge, then suddenly others had to follow. And we suddenly saw a few who were super reluctant, such as Japan, as you rightly said, who said like, okay, we jump on the train. And maybe this will lead within this interesting Paris movement to a dynamic that really makes a change. On the other hand, what I think we need to have back, especially in countries such as Austria, Germany, and the like, to really get the new Green Deal happening in the European Union, is pressure from below. And this is something where I think the pandemic is really a nightmare. I mean, it's a nightmare in many regards, definitely, but one bad consequences or negative consequence of the pandemic is simply that people can't protest the way they did before, and they can't protest for climate change action in the way we probably need to see it for policymakers to really realize that there is a huge part, hopefully, of societies in specific countries that want change. So I'm really, I'm not sure whether it's a silver lining or not, hopefully.
Gabi, thanks a lot. I'm going to hike up now the numbers that I'm going to throw your way to 5 in one bundle, okay, because there are quite a few. And next one on my list is Anastasia, please.
Hello, thank you very much for such an interesting presentation. And you have partly answered my question. So you said that people cannot protest as before, and that people have understood that the world can change. But probably you can name some other effects that you think pandemic had on the climate change process, and beside the fact that the world's attention was diverted to the fight against the pandemic. And how can you assess the effect, and how positive and tangible do you think this forced decline in carbon emissions was?
Thank you. And then next one is Nicholas, please.
Hello. Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation. It's been very insightful. I've got a question which is a bit maybe broad and more hypothetical in a way. Namely, if we look at the economic and financial impact of COVID, we've seen that many people are struggling financially and with their livelihoods. So obviously for many governments, rebuilding the economy as quickly as possible is probably going to be one of their main priorities. So what I've been wondering is, how can we reconcile this need to rebuild the economies as quickly as possible and return to the status quo, while also taking necessary and quick measures regarding climate? Do you think that maybe this could be a chance that maybe sort of like start from scratch, start from zero, and maybe rebuild the economy with climate actions in mind in a way? Or do you think that it's going to overshadow climate questions again? Thank you.
Nicholas, thank you. Next one on the list for questions is Afan, please.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. My question is twofold. Do you foresee or do you know of any systematic measures to somehow solve or manage the massive migration from third world countries due to foreseeable droughts caused by climate change? And secondly, what about active measures to actively step in to reverse the process of climate change? Examples being such as the CO2 concentration, acidification of the oceans, loss of biodiversity and such. Because as the known planetary boundaries concept developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center in 2009, which is widely accepted, we already crossed in the case of biodiversity and loss of and nitrogen cycle. Just generally asking. Thank you.
Thank you. And next on our list is our wonderful colleague from Salzburg, Reinhard Heinisch. Reinhard, your turn.
Hi, Gabi. Great job. Hi there. Two questions. First of all, I would like to know what your primary recommendations are, because you've described the reasons, but what would be your strategy? Would you pick tackle the most challenging reason, or would you pick the low-hanging fruit first? And then more generally, in political science, we often say that when we have two kinds of reforms competing with each other, we tend to be very bad trying to deliver on diffuse goals that are in the future versus concrete goals that are in the present or that are much closer to us. Do you see that as the primary problem, that it is the diffuse versus the concrete? So you have concrete economic sacrifices for diffuse future gains. Is that the issue? Or is the causal mechanism why it's so difficult that we don't quite know the distribution of winners and losers in the long run? And because the payoffs are now clear as to who is benefiting, who is losing, it creates sort of, you don't have, you lack the commitment on all parties concerned to be pushing as hard as they can, because the parties cannot quite foresee what the situation would be like at the end of the day, because it's such a complex, massive undertaking. So is it the distributional problem, or is it the short-term sacrifices and the long-term benefits that you see as the major problem in comparing these two?
Great, Reinhard, thank you very much. And then we have one more question left, and that's in that round, and that is by Moges, please.
I have a very short question. That is, do you recommend more regulations of international in climate change, which we already have a lot of treaties and mechanisms, and even including institutions? or maybe it is time to take stock of what has been achieved so far and just focus on more on implementation side? So which one do you choose, more regulation or more implementation? Thank you.
Perfect. That's an extremely interesting set of questions, and some I think I can answer in a combination. In that, what I think how the current crisis and climate change policies interact is something where I'm not completely sure in which direction it at the end of the day will go. On the one hand, I think the current crisis has shown us that certain things are, as some would say, low-hanging fruit, in that we all now experience that we can indeed work from home in our home office, as you see in my background here. Though I would prefer to go to the office, but it's really possible. And I think for many, it's possible to work more often from home, to travel less, to go to fewer conferences and the like. So I think on the one side, the pandemic has clearly shown us that there are certain measures that are not even that costly that would help the climate a lot and that would be feasible. At the same time, or on top of this, I think we know, and certain policymakers know for sure, especially I think Ursula von der Leyen, as our European Union Commission President, knows for sure that this is a chance to really rebuild our economy as it needs to be rebuilt. And this is a momentum where we can use this to rebuild it in a better way, in a greener way, in a more climate-friendly way. However, and there comes Reinhard's question in, what I think tackles as something I haven't talked, I mean, when I talked about the consequences and the distributional consequences of temporal winners, losers, and geographically wise winners and losers, one thing that is also very clear from climate change policy, something I haven't said so before, is that the losers of climate change policies, or part of the losers, will face massive losses, and they will face them rather sooner than later. And they are very powerful actors, such as the lobbies of the auto industry and the like. And they will do, and they have done a lot before, also energy companies and the like. And so here the distributional consequences were so unfortunate, in the sense that the losses were concrete, massive, but very concentrated. Typical political science situation where we find action that hampered moving forward, versus the benefits would arise in the future, distributed evenly, as we would prevent a climate crisis that would profit all of us. And so there are not these very concrete winners that would, on the other hand, lobby. And that is maybe brings me to the next aspect of how I think one should move forward and the like. I have already in 2003, I think, Scott Barrett, who's an environmental economist, had a book on environmental treaty making, and he criticized the Kyoto Protocol for being the wrong way to tackle this problem. And his argument was that this problem is just too complex to solve it in the way like it did, and no country really has incentives to stick to these emission reduction goals, because it really is to their own disadvantage. However, if we had thought about climate change as a multitude of problems, in that we need an energy transition, we need a transition towards changing how we travel, we need a change in agriculture, and so on. We need a change, we have a solar industry that one needs to empower and the like. If one doesn't see the problem as one huge problem in we need to tackle climate change, but in, I don't know, 1,000 or 100 smaller problems where we need these innovations, but see this a bit separately and then try to find these innovations, then suddenly we have more winners and more losers. And especially these winners, such as the solar industry, might then suddenly trigger more progress even. And then one can also get rid of this, or can maybe leave this big free riding international problem, because maybe it's not the international level that is so important, but really rather the country, the local levels. And where we see this, for instance, in the US, where we have this huge mayor's initiative, where cities formed a huge alliance to combat climate change, and they exchange different policies, and they really have this kind of race to the top where cities suddenly compete to be the most climate friendly one. And I think this is where that was also the last question, where we need to go, where we need to get, like, in a way where we really incentivize innovation, progress in various different fields without, I mean, of course, it all contributes to this big goal, but maybe it's like seeing this as a lot of little hurdles, but the little hurdles that we can hopefully cross and manage to get across. And this is, I think, how I, in some sense, hopefully see the way forward. Just one question that is a bit different than the others in the migration from the developing countries. This is something that I do a lot of research on. And here, my opinion is even is a bit different in the sense that, so what we currently see is that most individuals who need to leave their home because of environmental changes do not necessarily come to Austria, Germany and the like. Rather, they tend to stay in the region where they come from and just move within their own country or within their region. This means, however, that often we see regions where already they are at their capacity limit in how they tackle with social problems. They don't have enough jobs, they don't have enough houses, they don't have enough infrastructure and the like. And there the capacity constraints become even larger. In some sense, this means that the problem happens very far away from us here, but it's not that this makes the problem less, rather to the opposite. It makes it harder, and it makes it, but it's again a burden on countries that already are at a disadvantage. And this is where we also see a potential, we haven't talked about this at all today, for kind of climate change via migration potentially leading to more civil conflict. And what we see sometimes is that climate change in this context can really act as a threat multiplier, meaning that in those regions, in those instances where we already see a high threat for potential conflicts to erupt, this climate change induced migration might kind of tip the balance from a situation that was bearable to one that is no longer, and really increases problems that I think shouldn't be increased. So my bigger worry is not that this leads to massive migration to industrialized countries, where I think, but that's my opinion, we could much better deal with this type of migration, but it rather happens in regions that from a capacity perspective really are already under constraint and doesn't make any situations better there.
Thanks a lot. Then we do one more round of questions, because there's still quite a few. And I'm going to start with one that was asked via the Facebook page. So I'm going to read it to you. It's by Vanessa, who is one of our doctoral students. The Secretary General of NATO recently called for the alliance to address climate change. Could you comment on the securitization of climate change and its implications for international relations? So that was one question. And the next one is again via Zoom, and that's Gianluca, please.
Hi, yes. I'm curious when I think about barriers for policymakers to interact good climate change goal. It's, for me, it feels like it's a strong lobbying part as well, especially in the developed countries. And also relating to what you said, that we can't feel the first effects in the countries here, in the industrial countries. And a country where I think that is really not the case, or you can really feel it, is in Brazil with the rainforest, especially with the president also catering so strongly to the agricultural lobby. And I'm kind of wondering in what way it is the responsibility of, say, the G20 or really the industrialized countries for the greater good, or to save the planet in that sense, to intervene there, or to really also counter lobby these things by sharing more advanced technologies that we have at our disposal, so that the farmers don't need to burn the rainforest or stuff like that. Because I feel like that also maybe goes a bit back to the everybody, nobody, anybody story. You know, if no one is intervening with Brazil burning down the rainforest, then, you know, it's going to be bad for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianluca. And then it's Olivia, please.
Hi, mine is similar to what you just kind of went over, but how you said in your papers that the climate migration is usually within a country and that leads to further urbanization, which causes stress on society. I was wondering what kind of educational improvements or job or creation could be made in rural populations that could keep them there rather than stressing the urban population.
Thank you. And I have no more questions now, so therefore I'm going to abuse my opportunities here as a chair, and Gabi, ask you 2 questions as well, and we are again at 5. The first one is a bit triggered by the first slide of yours. So it was the caricature and it was the curves. And what I find interesting in terms of how things happen now in public debates and with COVID and everything, so that the public probably for the first time in a sustainable manner just gets exposed to these curves. Yeah. So that's just the scientific way of expressing something. That's obviously now a speculation about the future, but could that help perhaps also for climate? So, because it seems to me there are lots of these technical questions that are increasingly important for politics, and that probably also means, in a democratic sense, that it is important that the public can engage and does engage with these kinds of data and these kinds of ways of generating data, and with their political implications, of course. And then there's the second question. There's this book, I think it was by Homer Dixon, called The Ingenuity Gap, and that oftentimes made me worry, actually. So it basically says there's trouble, and then much belated, there's some kind of a technological solution to it, but then the technological solution itself is going to cause all kinds of trouble again. And as I understand, but Gabi, you know that much better than I do, there are experiments amongst natural scientists, for instance, in the United States, to send all kinds of chemicals up into orbit in order to shield away some of the sunlight and everything. That seems to me, not knowing anything about it, but it could be one of those examples of an ingenuity gap. So I was wondering what you think about it.
Okay, so this is again a lot of questions. One that I think I wanted to say already something about this before, but I don't know, totally forgot about this. And this is your point, Markus, about educating the general public and confronting them much more with with evidence, with scientific communication. And I think this is important. And what is not good for us as societies is that we so far still do not do, in my opinion, enough to educate our youth on this. So I think we really need to start much earlier, really showing what trouble this is, what the evidence currently is, what the problem is, and the like, and really educating the general public much more on this. And I think this is really important, especially so because I really, my biggest hope on progress is really the pressure from below, coming from the streets, the Fridays for Future protests and the like. And it's really the younger generations that need to press for this and make much more noise than they currently do so. So this is important. On the same side, we know there's a huge literature in psychology that investigates how to communicate this and how not to. For instance, it's really not a good idea it's a good idea to raise awareness, but it's not a good idea to do this via making people afraid of it, because fear is not a good guidance in doing something. Rather, people then suddenly don't do anything anymore. And this is something where I think we have a lot of expertise, and we just need to use this expertise better and move forward. The question on barriers to policymaking, like the lobbying, I think this is a huge problem as it is for many important issues, and climate change here is absolutely no difference. And as this relates to me back to what Reinhard said, like this really the concrete losses, concrete or very diffuse benefits geographic wise and whatever. The bigger issue is, and that's not an easy issue, is how to tackle this in an international setting. If the European Union was serious about really being a leader in climate change action, which they should, I think, then they should do much more. And then it's not enough to simply have an additional clause in a preferential trade agreement on climate change, such they do with Mercosur, because we know from literature too that this is not the tool to really make big change. I mean, this might make some changes on the margin, but this is not a way to really induce countries such as Brazil to change their climate change policies. So if you really want to get serious, one has to get to certain bargains that really make a difference. And this is again going back to what I made an argument for in the last round, namely if one maybe started to tackle this more in a sectoral perspective and thinking about, okay, we need to have agricultural change, we need to have energy change, we need to have transportation system change and the like. This might become easier than thinking about a one big international agreement that needs to tackle it all, because this is what we fail. I mean, we have this agreement, but it's like a bottom-up agreement that I'm not sure won't matter that much here too much. That leads to the next point, the securitization of on NATO and the question of climate change as a security threat, which it is. For those countries that I mentioned before, where climate change really acts as a threat multiplier, and as much as these countries are might be a security risk for NATO members, this of course affects them too. There are additional aspects that might make NATO think about this, how to combat in a world with a heating climate and the like. There are lots of issues that are connected to this. I think it's better them thinking about this as, the more actors really are serious in doing something to combat climate change, the better, I would argue. But it's not we shouldn't say like, okay, now NATO understood that climate change can be a security risk, so all will be kind of okay. So this is a side aspect and probably an important side aspect, hopefully, but this is really, At the same time, and this brings me then back to the question, what to do with those countries in which now already face huge consequences of climate change and which also are at potential risk of conflict. And I would definitely make the argument that one should assist these countries, not only because they might become a security risk for us here, not at all, but but more importantly, because these countries should be assisted in finding a ways to solve these problems and not making climate change make these matters worse, and how to do this. And I think there are already specific organizations such as the World Bank that have, or the Food and Agricultural Program of the United Nations, that have a lot of expertise in helping or assisting individuals in these countries to deal with specific types of these changes, such as using drought-resistant crops, improving their precipitation systems, irrigation systems, and the like. So there is already expertise there, and this should be simply, or this needs to be increased. And it's clear that we not only need to do something about mitigating climate change, but really we need to invest a lot in adaptation measures, especially in these countries. However, here it might happen that, and this is something we see oftentimes in this migration context, namely that there's some literature that shows that certain parts of societies in these countries, they are even what they call trapped populations, namely that these are individuals that might want to leave, but they simply don't have the resources to do so. And it might be that one helping these individuals that then even that at first what happens is that migration even increases. So this is a very, very interesting relationship, very tricky relationship, if one wants to call it this way. And so also no easy answers on this front. And then your last point, Markus, oh yeah, this, and what I see here, and I'm super much forward looking to a conversation I will have in terms of one of our study programs next Wednesday with a philosopher. For me, many of these measures that you have just said are specific types of technologies that might be available someday in a way that really allows us to get CO2 out of the atmosphere, to store it better in the ocean, under the Earth's surface and the like. This, to me, raises a lot of ethical questions that we also need to really think carefully in the sense of who will be in charge of these processes, who will have the say here, who will be doing this, how will power politics play into this? And I mean, as you rightly say, this worries me as much as it might provide some hope. So yeah, this is a huge topic, a very interesting topic, and I think a topic on which we really need a lot of expertise, especially so from philosophers and people who know maybe better answers than I do here. So
thank you so much for a really great talk. Thanks a lot for your patience in answering all our questions. I really learned a lot. Again, under normal circumstances, down there in the Festsaal, you would have a big round of applause now, and you definitely have deserved it. Thanks so much. Thanks a lot for everyone in the audience. Maybe one thing that's, or maybe three quick things that I still want to mention. The first one is in this talk too, there was something about the relationship between science and politics. For those of you interested in looking at that in the medical field, we had in our lecture series a very interesting talk about that with David Heyman, who's actually one of the most well-known epidemiologists in the world. And then this lecture series is gonna go on a Christmas break now. It's gonna start again in January, and we'll regularly have these public events, and I'd be very happy if you're with us again. And then also, and as my third point, I want to say a specific thank you to everyone of the member of the working group of the ÖFG who is tuned in here. And I'm obviously looking forward to seeing you in mid-December when we're gonna look back to the year 2020, which has been quite a year, and I think there'll be a lot to talk about. So thanks a lot again to everyone, and I hope to see you soon again. Bye-bye.